Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, let me recognize in the back of the committee room is a group of nursing students who are here today from North Georgia College and University up in Dahlonega. Students, stand and be recognized. We're glad to have you all with us today. Very good. You can go home and and tell your friends you've seen sausage made today. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, we need to adopt new rules today, even though we're in the middle of the two-year term, because we have 3 less committee members this year, so our quorum has changed and is now only 14, which is a wonderful thing. As you know, we struggle sometimes with the quorum. So in your folder, you'll see a set of rules, and I have not changed anything except the quorum. So if you want to look those over and somebody make a motion, we'll move on those. Have a motion by Senator Mullis, second by Senator Balfour to adopt these rules. Any discussion? All right, all in favor, please raise your hand if you're in favor of these rules. And thank you. And all opposed? I think it's unanimous. Very good. Let me, before we start also, and the author may recognize him, but we're very pleased to have the Chancellor of the Board of Regents with us today, Chancellor Hank Huckabee, who's here. We appreciate you coming. I don't know that a Chancellor, I don't know the Chancellor's been to a committee meeting very often, except when maybe we were coming to talk about the budget or something, but we appreciate you coming. This is it indicates your level of interest and how important the subject is. We're going to call up Senate Bill 302, Senator Staten. Senator Staten, you can come up to the podium if you like. I think you will be turned on. And we'll get started in consideration of your bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the Appropriations Committee. I'm pleased to bring before you Senate Bill 302 and ask for your favorable consideration this afternoon. For many of you who are returning from last year, this will look familiar. It is, in fact, a bill which increases the amount of bonding authority for the Georgia Higher Education Facilities Authority from $300 to $500 million. This bill passed out of appropriations last year and indeed passed out of the Senate. It went over to the House of Representatives where it received an unfriendly amendment, and though it was agreed to near the end of the session, the governor chose to veto the bill, not because of the underlying legislation, which we're back discussing again this afternoon, but because of the amendment that was added in the House. So this is something that is very important, and I would certainly hope you will join me again this session in supporting this request. I do want to go through, just in case some of you don't remember the particulars, or maybe some of you are new, as to what we're really doing here, and we have some slides which will perhaps help us all understand a little better about why we are where we are today and why we're asking for this increase. First of all, you may recall that JHIFA was created back in 2006 with Senate Bill 562. This original legislation authorized the issuance of revenue bonds to finance projects for the Board of Regents and the Technical College System of Georgia. There was a requirement, which is still there, that all projects must have a self-liquidating revenue source that is pledged for the repayment of the bonds, and this can come from mandatory student fees or housing rents or parking revenue or other kinds of revenues. There is a board that oversees JHIFA that are appointed pursuant to the original bill, and the original legislation allowed for the issuance of up to $300 million in revenue bonds. There have been 3 issues, 2008, 9, and 10, and as you will see, a total thus far of $294,915,000 in revenue bonds have been issued under this act. This has funded 18 projects on 13 campuses throughout the state of Georgia. It's provided, for example, residence halls with over 1,600 beds, parking decks for over 1,600 parking spaces, and over 500,000 square feet of student center, recreation, bookstore, and dining hall buildings that serve in our university system more than 54,000 students. We've got a map that shows you the distribution of these projects around the state. I want you to make sure you understand these have not just been at one institution or two institutions, but as you can see, at many of the institutions around the state and your districts, they have benefited from this very important program. There's a list, and I think you have a copy of this if you're interested. I'm certainly not going to go over all of it, but it can show you the various projects that were in the various phases that have led to where we are today. And you can also get a sense of those projects in some of the photographs here, very nice facilities that have improved the situation for students on many different campuses in our state. And as you will know, we've seen dramatic growth in the university system, particularly in recent years. I think we've grown the equivalent of another University of Georgia in the university system in just the last 3 or 4 years. You'll also see the price of some of these projects. They can go from $5 million all the way up to $30–40 million, and that also helps to understand why after a number of years we have reached the limit of the original legislation at the $300 million mark. There's some photographs of the 2009 projects and then the 2010 projects as well. So that brings us to the bill today. And very simply, we are asking to increase the maximum authorization from $300 million to $500 million. It will continue to be there for the support of needed revenue-producing projects for the Board of Regents and the Technical College System of Georgia. All of these projects must continue to have that self-liquidating revenue source to repay the bonds. The revenue bond projects, just to make sure we're clear, are not included as a part of the state's constitutionally limited debt capacity. And I would say to the Chancellor's credit, he has instituted an even more depth review process for these revenue-producing projects as we move forward to ensure that only the best and most needed projects are recommended for funding. I would just add that all of the projects currently on the list that have been done to this point in time are fulfilling the obligations appropriately and adequately. There's not been any problems with this program, and it is estimated that by making this increase, we will give them the flexibility they need for a number of years to come to be able to use this important vehicle for this type of project for the university system and the technical college system. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I would urge support for this bill and would be glad to entertain any questions. And I know the Chancellor is here as well, who would be willing to make some comments.
Chancellor, why don't you want to just say a word about the need for these? In fact, they also something you noted the other day when we talked was that they're pretty much all out in the state at smaller institutions which might have less ability to fund on a private basis.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've hit on the primary reason for having this kind of financing vehicle available. A number of years ago, quite frankly, we started looking at these kinds of options when I was budget director in the mid-90s. We came to the conclusion that the facility needs on our college campuses could not continue to be met by the typical process of state GO bonds. The needs were so great in terms of classrooms, libraries, laboratories, et cetera, that where there was an opportunity to find an alternative means of financing projects like this, we needed to go in that direction. So that was a growing impetus for this kind of a program. And we're still in that situation. The demand, the backlog, for example, that we have right now, just to meet those basic academic program needs, preclude us from, at any point I see in the near future, ever going back to funding these kinds of projects with general obligation bonds. When we have these kinds of projects, it is something that we take very seriously, and as Senator Staten has indicated, We are taking a harder look now. One of the things that I've asked our staff to do is to reevaluate and be sure we're on course with each project that has been funded thus far. And quite frankly, I'm likely to increase the requirement in terms of the debt ratio that will require these projects. Not that this current policy is flawed, but I think we need to, in these uncertain times, have a little stricter policy going forward. We will be evaluating each request from the campuses in terms of, one, their financial ability and stability, the real need. Just because a campus wants to apply does not mean we will necessarily approve it. We're going to be looking based on needs rather than wants. But I think it's an outstanding program, and I think it's already made a tremendous impact on our campuses, and I hope we can continue to do that. Between John and myself, we'll be happy to answer any questions from you or the committee.
All right, Senator Staten, why don't you come back, and Chancellor, if you'll stand by, and John, and we've got, I see 3 lights on. We'll go through these. President Pro Tem Williams.
Senator, this does not apply to the University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and some other schools that have their own funding mechanisms. Is that true?
It could, but we have not. They've not. If you saw the list, it has not been used at those institutions, but predominantly at the smaller institutions around the state have been the schools that have benefited from this, because they don't have always the foundation support and the local support that the major research institutions do.
But the larger university do bond projects that are revenue generators.
That is correct.
Do you have any idea what that number is?
The total that's outstanding, it's approximately $3 billion. How much?
$3 billion.
Is there any oversight to making sure that those facilities are generating revenue and they're on track to pay them off over time? Does that come through this, Chief?
Do you want to say something, Chancellor?
That's a good question. Those projects we're talking about here, what we refer to as PPV projects, public-private partnerships or ventures, and we have done the similar evaluation of those projects at my request to be sure that they are financially sound, that they are on track according to their obligations and generating the revenue and paying off that debt. And I have since moved both of those evaluation processes, both for the JHEFA projects and the PPV projects, relocated them to be under the supervision and evaluation of John Brown. And we're at the point where everything is performing properly, but it's something that we evaluate continually. And
it's a large number.
It's a large number, and quite frankly, when I took this job, I knew it was a large number. I didn't know it was quite that large, but we are aware of that, and we're going to stay on top of that because, quite frankly, I've been where you are. I've been head of an agency like this, and we cannot afford fiscally or politically, quite frankly, to have any of these projects not be able to form financially.
Is there, if we look at the last 3 years, $100 million a year or so, or in some cases less, but if we're averaging $100 million a year, what's going to keep us from coming back in 2 years and having spent the $500,000 and need more money?
To be honest with you, that's quite likely, because the needs are not going away. They're not diminishing. Our enrollments are growing. The needs are growing. But I hope we're not back here in 2 years doing that. But I wouldn't tell you we won't be. But I hope that if we do come back, we'll still have a very solid record of performance, both in terms of what we're building, where we're building it, and the financial viability of those.
Is there only 2 or 3 revenue generators? I mean, it's a dorm, it's a parking lot, or it's a food service.
Food service, bookstores.
Once everybody gets those, they should be set.
We would hope so. A lot of these, Senator, are generated by the interests of the students themselves. One of the largest areas up here that Senator Staten showed you was the 500,000 square feet and particularly athletic or recreational kinds of facilities. Those are the facilities that the students themselves take the initiative and want the administration to provide means of those being built, and they themselves vote the fees necessary to fund those facilities.
Chairman Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on the President Pro Tem's question, in the larger universities, do they have a cap? Do you have a cap on them?
We do not. The way those typically are funded, and I'll speak primarily, say, to the University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, and sometimes Georgia Southern, and probably to some degree Georgia State University. Those entities have a what we'll call, I know at the university we called it the University of Georgia Real Estate Foundation. They issue bonds, they get a rating, they're revenue bonds, and they have the financial wherewithal to sustain those financially. Now, they are approved by the Board of Regents. They can't just go out and do those on their own. So there is oversight to their projects. And quite frankly, those institutions like Tech and Georgia State and sometimes Georgia Southern, they have because of their size, they have a lot more flexibility in financial depth than, say, the small schools that you saw listed up here. But no, we do monitor that. We keep on top of that, and we know what they're building, why they're building, and they do have to be approved by our staff and our board before they can go forward.
But there is no cap.
No.
Okay. My second question is this. I'm a little bit confused, and it's kind of what the President Pro Tem asked as well. If we continue on the pace we're on, 2 more years, we'll be at the $500 million. It's been about $100 million every year. How long are these bonds issued for? How long before they start? Some of them start coming off of the books.
Typically 20 years. Some might be 25, but typically 20 years is when the bonds are paid off.
So if we have $300 million right now, just in round figures, it'll be 20 years before. I know not all of them are all going to come at the same time, but the ones that were issued in 2008, it was, say, in round figures, 100,000. That it'll take 20 years for 100,000 to come off. Will you decrease that liability, if you will, at some point to say we've got this much cushion left?
Well, excuse me, the liability is going down each year because
Right.
they're amortizing those projects. But for those projects, say, that were sold in 2008, for them to totally come off, it would be 16, 17 years from now. But their outstanding debt is declining every year. Yeah. And John tells me we have addressed a lot of the backlog needs. So we would anticipate, I'm not promising you, but we anticipate the level of requests and needs will begin to slow down over the next 2 or 3 years.
Senator Hooks.
I don't have a question, Mr. Chairman, but I have a kind of a first nature comment that I would add to Senator Staten's bill, which I totally support. I'm on the Fort Valley State University Foundation, have been on there for over 20 years. And within that foundation, we formed an LLC, 5-member LLC, that went out and if you look at page 6, the third from the top, that's Fort Valley State's commitment on that. And the 5-member LLC is chaired by a banker, bank president there in Fort Valley, and I serve on it, and then 3 alumni. The Chancellor's office has been very good to supply very good talent. We have a good local lawyer. Then we have a bond lawyer here in Atlanta that takes it to an additional step on the local level. And we were faced with the problem there at Fort Valley State, because Fort Valley's a town of about 8,000 or 9,000 people. There wasn't any housing at all. The last dormitory built on that campus was built in the 1950s. Some of them were built back during the New Era deal with WPA money. And we were having a difficult time recruiting students. There was no private housing in the city of Fort Valley per se. So we decided to build what's known as Wildcat Commons, and we built some beautiful dormitories down there and the student center. But before any spade was turned, we had already the students signed up. But the dormitories we had there were these old, one bathroom on a floor with one shower, and similar to what Senator Hill and I went to college under, that are not suitable by today's standards to recruit students to the university. So we have filled it up, and it has stayed good. But what I think the committee needs to know is there is an additional step on within the local foundation. We have a corporation, and they're made up of knowledgeable people, and the Chancellor's office has done a great job of supplying and guiding that. But they're not just checklists to some local foundation to do that, and they work very well. We could have never built those dormitories and student center without this assistance. So it's a good more or less public-private partnership.
I'm just glad to see they've got dirt floors, unlike when we were there, huh?
Thank you.
Senator Heath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, help me understand in the list of items that this $300 million has been used to construct so far. Were things like bookstores, recreational facilities, and student centers. Help me understand how those expenses, those capital investments, help in the education process and how they generate revenue. Does a new bookstore generate more revenue than an old bookstore? And does a ball field generate revenue? Does a student center generate revenue, or a newer student center generate more revenue than an old student center? I understand you say that these are revenue generating facilities. So can you help me understand how those work?
Well, I would make the general comment, Senator, that student consumerism is alive and well in the world, and there is a lot of competition in a lot of places where our kids can go to school. And it is the case that there are certain expectations today when they come to campuses, and they are, quite frankly, willing to pay for it, be that through fees or other mechanisms. Most people want a place to park their car, and they would like to have recreational facilities that enhance the quality of their experience while they're students on a campus. So I think that this is a part, frankly, of the overall success of our institutions and the great growth that we've seen within the university system and its appeal to students, certainly within the state of Georgia. But those fees or revenue sources are dedicated with respect to these projects in a very careful process, which is vetted very carefully in order to make sure that the revenues are there to pay these bonds off over the time, if they're 20-year bonds, 25-year bonds, whatever the case may be. I have a college-age son and one on the way, but I do think these things enhance the overall academic experience, perhaps in ways that we hardly remember, given our college experiences many moons ago. I don't know what Georgia Tech was like way back then, but I think they are important today.
Well, Senator, you used the phrase student consumerism. Mm-hmm. Have you any idea how many students pay for their own college education now?
I don't know an exact figure, but certainly in Georgia we've been very blessed because of the Hope Scholarship.
I was talking about students who paid for their own education. Well, student consumerism.
that will vary by institution in terms of the number of kids who are on scholarships of one kind or another, be it HOPE or other financial assistance programs, and how many of those that I assume you mean absolutely pay the full ride for their education. Is that your question?
Exactly. And, the reason I mentioned that is the cost of an education today is just skyrocketing. And I would suggest that very few students pay for their own education. I don't know how many parents pay for those students' education, but very few students pay for that education. Let me just conclude by saying this sounds a lot like the issue that's been before Congress in recent months. We've got a debt ceiling. We're against that debt ceiling, and some wish to increase that debt ceiling. And the comment was made that if you increase this debt ceiling, we'll be back in a couple of years because we'll have used up the amount of spending that you have authorized to us. How do I explain that to my constituents, that we continue to raise the debt ceilings?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question you raise, but I think there's a significant difference here, at least as far as I'm concerned, Senator. I would share your frustration and that of many others regarding unchecked spending in Washington, D.C., but the difference is with a lot of that spending, we really can't see anything that it's tied to materially. In this case, you can look at those photographs that were up at the screen, on campuses all across the state of Georgia, and you can see what that money is being used for. And not only that, but it's not money that's just sent down a hole never to reappear. This is money that's going to be repaid, and there are guaranteed sources for repaying it over the life of the bonds. So this is, let me just say from my perspective on this, we are in unprecedented times with respect to the cost of borrowing money. Each one of those projects around the state of Georgia is in some respects economic development. It's putting people to work. It's smaller construction companies who can get some of these projects, unlike the big ones at Tech or UGA, where maybe it takes such a large firm that the small construction companies in Georgia can't get the capacity in order to carry out the project. So I think these are very important things at this particular point in time, which really do make a difference in our communities. And then if it helps to bring those students to these campuses, that's a good thing too, because those students, even if their tuition may be paid through HOPE or other sources or their parents, they're also going to be out in those communities spending dollars and having an economic impact that's very positive. So I see it as a very different thing than raising the debt ceiling in Washington, where that money's never coming back in most cases, and it's hard to see something definitive tied to those expenditures, whereas here I think that's absolutely not the case.
Senator Mellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator, for bringing us this bill today. Before I give you a couple of friendly questions, I'd like to thank the Chancellor for being here. And one of the reasons that many of us support this is because we know your background and that you're a great steward of this taxpayers' money by being over OPB for some time and then being a legislator. So we feel real at ease with looking at this issue with your ability, and thank you for that. And your great staff, too, by the way. And Senator, you kind of hit on this a minute ago, and you took my thunder, but isn't it true that with the trying times we have more people going to school than ever before?
That's correct.
So it's important that we have the right accessories and classrooms to meet their needs, like these wonderful nursing students that we have here, to make sure that we have plenty of classrooms so we can teach the nursing profession that is widely needed throughout not only this state but America, but also for the state to be more competitive. We need an educated workforce in many trades, and for us to ensure that with more people going to school, we have to have the facilities to support that. Is that not true?
I think you're absolutely correct, Senator, and as I've said many times, the university system in our state, we're so fortunate. It is a bright and shining star. We have many challenges in our state, certainly in education and K-12 education, but we have one of the finest university systems in the country, and we can be proud.
That and technical schools, too.
Absolutely.
But I know it's crucial for economic development. Plus, the jobs that will be created by this needed expansion of some of our classrooms will provide many jobs in our community that will also fulfill the needs of the community at large. So I think this is a well-needed project. Thank you for it.
That was more a beach ball than a softball. Ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, of the committee, we have exhausted the questions, and I think reached the point where we need to make a decision. So, what is the pleasure of the committee? Motion by Senator Hooks, do pass. Second by Senator Mullis. Other discussion on that motion? Okay, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hand and hold them a second. Got it? Okay, and opposed? Okay, see one opposed. Very good. The bill passes out as submitted, and we'll go to rules. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr.